There we go. Okay, beautiful. So let us begin with our questions. So I'm going to kind of go quick, in part because I do have a bit of an agenda, but our policy stands, which is anybody that has a point at any time, jump in. Even if you're rudely interrupting, I will not mind whatsoever. However, what I need to do, sorry, is make sure that no one else is joining. Sorry. Here we go. Okay, I got it. Okay, now I can control. So yeah, so do jump in like with your voice, because I won't be able to monitor the actual written chat. So question one is, what does Karatani mean by the multitude, and does he share Negri and Hart's conception of its social composition? And yeah, I mean, he actually has a number of critiques of their conception. He makes the point that it was not Spinoza, but Thomas Hobbes who initiated the concept, and that this is important, in part because, you know, Hart and Negri are a bit too accelerationist for Karatani. They sort of seem to be ignorant of the role of the state, and in their very definition of empire, he notices a lot of inconsistencies. And once we get to that part of the text, we'll see these inconsistencies pretty clearly. So on the one hand, Karatani says Hart and Negri are the contemporary Marxists of, he claims that the Empire series is a kind of reading of Marx that is by the grain, that is like maybe about as orthodox as one could be. Because keep in mind, Karatani, and you see this in the name manifesto, he is so critical of Marxists, and much of his criticism is around, obviously, this point that Uno, his colleague from Japan, the Marxist theoretician, realized, which was that in order for capital to reproduce itself, there's a absolutely necessary relationship of the state for the accumulation cycle to take place, which we'll look at, because it's that insight which allows for him to completely reperiodize the so-called stages of capitalism from the world system theory. So he has that criticism of contemporary Marxists, but the other striking criticism he often brings is a criticism around belief. And he basically wishes to say that Marxist belief is a kind of absolutely problematic part of any praxis today, one that always gets kind of caught within the pincer of social democracy. So he is, despite the irony that contemporary Marxist-Leninists would declare Karatani a kind of idealist, renegade, or outlaw, he nonetheless gives us one of the most biting critiques of social democracy, in my view. So we'll get to that, but that's a few points. Most importantly, does Karatani's comment that, quote, to wit, the people who were called the proletariat in the 1848 uprisings should not be thought of as industrial workers. They were, in fact, the multitude. Does this relate in any way to his argument that revolutionary movements arise out of struggles not at the site of production, but in the sphere of circulation? Absolutely, I think this is the case. We'll see the redefinition of the proletariat that he offers. And like, I think many contemporary Marxists, including people like Badiou, you know, he's not even comfortable retaining the concept of proletariat. So he does see it as maybe anachronistic, and yet nonetheless, he's advocating for a much broader interpretation vis-a-vis the definition of any wage labor relation on the one hand, and then on the other hand, obviously, as you know from reading, the praxis is centered at the site of consumption and also at the site of circulation. This next question is a really interesting one. I'm not sure that I'm the best person for it, but is there a space for forcing in Badiou's sense within Karatani's framework? I think obviously it depends on how fancy you want to get theoretically, because in Badiou's use of the term, he's using the aid of this very interesting disjunction that he's recognized in being an event, really starting with Lacan's reading of Plato, that there is a kind of disjuncture between knowledge and truth, and that truth sort of runs out ahead of knowledge. And so when you incorporate the condition of politics, a forcing procedure is necessary. And so a forcing procedure then maps onto the kind of Maoist notion of investigation, of worker investigation, or of worker inquiry, so that you sort of, you think the possibility of a future anterior, of a sort of development of a set of utterances, let's say on a factory floor, of workers in struggle with management. And you can sort of formalistically superimpose a forcing of the propositions that they make and the level to which those propositions gain efficacy within their situation. So I was thinking about this in terms of the focus of today's meeting, which really is on the praxis of Karatani's method. And he splits his method into two. On the one hand, he's advocating for the creation of an alternative economic arrangement outside of capital. But this is not to be understood, I think, in the notion of like Bitcoin and so on. He's using a completely different methodology of exchange based on reciprocity, yet still maybe retaining a form of currency. So maybe at some point we could discuss that. But then the second point is that he's advocating boycott at the site of consumption. And I think in both instances, I'm not sure that a Kantian theory of the subject lends itself to the method of forcing. This is like a speculative intuition of mine. I'm going to leave it at that. And maybe if the person who asked that question wishes to elaborate, they're more than welcome to, but if not, I'll move on. Okay, in what way might mode D be mobilized in the form of a signifier of the left? Signifier for the left or signifier of the left? I think it's two different things, the way it's phrased. Would it mean a leftist reclaiming of religious jouissance from the right? Oh, that's a very nice way to phrase this question. No, I mean, I do not see the orientation of associationism as parasitic on religion, even as a lot of contemporary Marxists are with like the turn to interest in St. Paul, for example, or even emancipatory thought within Islamic tradition. I think Karatani is because of his Kantian commitments, much more in line with a secularization of religion. Yet, it's very obvious that the activists or the members of the association remain within their sort of pre-committed places. So all of the civic associations in which they're affiliated are not meant to be renounced to join the association movement, which is a very interesting kind of, if you like, anti-Christian idea, because as you know, the statement of St. Paul, which is very beautiful for many leftists, especially us sectarian leftists, which is one does not join the revolutionary community unless they've performed a severing of ties or a renunciation of all of their commitments. And I think this is something which Karatani is not committed to doing. And so again, this kind of relates to the forcing question, which is there's a certain autonomy, which may be too loose, perhaps, This is my reading, and I think this is a common theme we've seen with Karatani, which is his version of Marxism is somehow radically neutralizing of sectarian potential. So this is very fresh for those of us weathering the storm of hysteria and cancel culture and so on and so forth, of the fallout of social democracy and so on. So, yet at the same time, I fear that Karatani's method runs the risk of rendering some ideological divisions, let's say the ideological division between liberalism and socialism. I worry that because he's so loose with this Kantian autonomy and so on, that maybe, you know, these ideological commitments are rendered superfluous or rendered less antagonistic than maybe they should be. It's obvious he's doing that for his philosophical reasons, but I think it's also very much an assault on the purges of Stalinism and some of the failures of Maoism. So that has to be kept into consideration, no doubt. Next question, Karatani argues for a world republic. However, many indigenous intellectuals, Eileton Krinick and Nick Estes, for example, speak about a world of many worlds. Would a simultaneous revolution in many worlds overcome some of the problems of a simultaneous revolution in a single world? And if so, how could we begin to think what such a revolution would look like? Would it substantially be different from the program Karatani outlines? Consumer boycotts, producer co-ops, military renunciation. Yeah, I mean, I think the introduction of cross-national and eventual withering of the nation-state form is the secret to this question, is a certain introduction of a different form of reciprocity that's not tethered to mode C, and the way in which Karatani is assuming that that reciprocity would enable two things to happen. One, the dissolution of mode C and its hold and its requirement for surplus extraction. And then two, perhaps it would further even the goal of what is implicit in the question, which is a kind of re-autonomization of the multiplicity of worlds, of the integrity or of the dignity of these different expressions. So I think he would give quite a positive answer to that. I don't think that he would have trouble answering that, even though I'm not answering it that well. And again, if anybody wants to jump in on that, that would be more than welcome. What is the difference between renouncing military power and gifting military sovereignty to the UN? Has Karatani anywhere written about what it would mean for the UN to accept this gift? In terms of what legal structures would need to be in place and what powers, if any, would thus be conferred. I can see how land might be placed in a perpetual trust, but I'm not clear on how military sovereignty could be so simply extracted from circulation without there being some higher sovereignty to safeguard this. I see what you mean. Yeah, I think this is actually like the missing, because he's very fond of Gandhi, he's very fond of nonviolence, and yet in order for a proletarian revolution to seize the apparatus of the military, even though it may be governed by the reciprocity of mode B, obviously it is, not so much C, it obviously is determined by C. So it seems to me that the confrontation at level of mode B necessitates violence. And then perhaps it then is therefore a naivete on his part to foreclose that. And if you read the manifesto, he does sort of foreclose violence. So I don't know how I feel about that, because it seems to me that the seizure of the military would necessitate a return to the question of dictatorship of proletariat, to be blunt. So, you know, okay. Karatani often writes, it's obvious that the problems of worker movements encountered in 19th and 20th century would not necessarily be encountered by a consumer movement in the 21st. But surely many of his comments on the limitations of actual workers' movements can also be made of actual consumer movements, in particular, their tendency to align workers as consumers with the interests of capital. I may have power over capital as a consumer, but if I need to eat and there is a famine, what good does that power do to me? Or if I have to have a computer in order to apply for a job and a smartphone in order to keep it, isn't there a tendency in these propositions to see the faults in the opposing opposition and ignore the potential weakness? Yeah. I mean, I think even in aesthetics, you saw that kind of neo-bohemian organizing called Burning Man, which I think is now global, which was founded on reciprocal gift exchange, and which was a kind of DIY struggling artist coming together in the desert, actually incidentally inspired by like a single person's heartbreak with his girlfriend, but now has materialized into a kind of like uber commodified, like pinnacle of finance capital. Like it's like the erosion of Mode C is absolutely visible within Burning Man, and it's perceived as a tragedy by all of the founders, and like many people have left, and it's pretty much a finished project. So I certainly agree that the sort of stage of financial capital in which we exist puts into doubt or puts into question Karatani's insistence of these autonomous separations between C, B, and so on. And I'm going to mention that vis-a-vis Marx in one of my slides. So I fully agree. And I also would say, not that I'm aware of, have sort of large-scale boycotts been orchestrated with explicit Marxist ends in mind. So the coordination of the boycott, although that's not the exclusive tactic, there are others, tends to be a kind of, let's say, liberal, consumerist, ethical living orientation. And again, if you read the manifesto of Karatani, he's very much not worried about the kind of usurpation of kind of what Zizek always critiques of, like the Whole Foods, Starbucks, ethical capitalism business. He literally does not seem to be concerned about that. Perhaps because when he invokes the concept of the ethical, he's invoking it with a much more sincere and sophisticated commitment to philosophy, right? As opposed, you see, so I think that that's a real vulnerability of the associationist praxis that really should be looked at, in my view. That doesn't mean that we should discard it completely and so on, but maybe what it means is we need to add additional tactics onto it, perhaps. So is information really the negative form of D, or is it just the synonym for this capital nation state's attempt to control consumers in the way the factory enabled them to control workers by turning every aspect of our lives into a site of extraction? And if that is so, does Karatani's call to organize consumers as workers not potentially come too late? Or is there something about organizing workers as consumers that Karatani does not explain here, but which might be able to circumvent this ongoing counter-revolution? Yeah, I'll be interested to see what Wark has to say about this, given that she really develops this in Capital is Dead. Specifically, the kind of way in which a new vanguard of the proletariat, what she calls the hacker class, sort of possesses a sort of relation within the vector of information as a force of production. The hacker class possesses a kind of subversive, emancipatory function within. I'm thinking of this guy, Aaron Schwartz, the sort of the martyr of JSTOR, the great liberator of the JSTOR articles. But there's been a lot of criticism of Wark's proposal of the hacker class. And a lot of that criticism links to some of the pitfalls of the limitation of sociological characteristics of what's called the precariat. And I think we've been familiar with this term, and we have over the years with the anti-globalization movement, kind of puffed them up a bit as an emancipatory agent. And in the same way that left accelerationism and now left populism have let us down, I think the emancipatory potential for the precariat or the hacker class also have significant weaknesses, if I'm being honest. So I don't think, therefore, that information is somehow inherently negative. And I don't know that Gabriel's point was that either, although he could respond to that better. Okay, now we have a long comment on Marcel Mauss and the theory of the gift, and how Mauss's student Hertz proposes a kind of asymmetry. And well, I think the only thing, and I'll let you read that comment, but I think the thing I would respond to here is that doesn't Karatani critique Marcel Mauss' theory of the gift, specifically the way that he's invoking the concept of magic of the gift? I mean, he supports aspects, but I think he is not invoking Marcel Mauss in this way, which is kind of a doctrinaire or sort of dogmatic and so on. He really goes much further than him. I just have to say, as an aside, I read a short biographical piece on Marcel Mauss, and he was apparently an anti-Bolshevik, anti-communist social democrat. So obviously Karatani is not going to like him for those political reasons, because the sort of great theoretician of the gift was horrified that the Bolsheviks refused to pay the debts of the Tsar once they took power in Russia. And so really, I think he was very much a liberal in the sense that he wished for these kind of, like, you know, it's very odd that he would not be in favor of the notion of jubilee, for example, of oppressed groups and so on when it comes to debt. So anyways, does Karatani's commitment to Marcel Mauss and to Kant not in fact end up committing him to a single transcendental viewpoint from which freedom and obligation, ditto equality and inequality, are universal categories which exist independent of any transcritical attempt to decenter them? So transcritique can in fact only operate inside these categories rather than to suggest a larger plurality of experiences which exceed them. Is it not the case that structure of world history actually offers, in many of its passages and arguments, a more homogenized form of transcendental than the one Gabriel suggested we might aspire to in the last session? Perhaps a critical approach to transcritique from this perspective would see it as itself a local position situated within some larger regime of relationality, something like Viveiros de Castro's multi-perspectivism, rather than as having itself located that regime as a manifestation of mode A from its own transcendental position, however mobile that position may be. Or does just asking these questions mean that I am in fact an unrepentant postmodernist? That's a fabulous comment question. And yes, how dare you ask that question? You are absolutely a kind of renegade postmodernist, relativist, I don't even know. No, but you really raise a nice point. I think Gabriel has shown that the De Castro's multi-perspectivism is very much in line and very congruent with Karatani's project. And the two would actually have a kind of simpatico relation on the one hand. On the other hand, I'm not quite sure what you mean by a single transcendental viewpoint. Because as I understand his notion of regulative idea, it's not reducible to a sort of subsumption, as I understand you're proposing it, as a sort of, well, an associative community sort of falls under a kind of transcendental trance with a particular form of the definition of X, Y, or Z. Or I'm not really envisioning the notion of what he's proposing as regulative idea in that way. But maybe you can comment more now or as we go on. Okay. How are we doing here? So let us continue with a review. So in chapter 10, Karatani makes the clear point that there's a lot of misunderstanding, and he does the work to show that the only sensible way in which the Kantian apparatus, both primarily ethical apparatus, can actually get off the ground is through its instantiation in material forms of exchange. On the one hand, on the other hand, he obviously makes the claim, which requires some biographical research as well, that Kant was an adamant critic of mercantile capitalism during his time, and that he, like Marx, flirted with the idea of associations which would be governed by modes of exchange outside of this sort of mercantile capitalism of his time. So therefore, mode B and mode C are absolutely essential for the abolition and the realization of the kingdom of ends. Now, I think it's very striking, and I'd like to see more developed on this, the distinction he makes, which is a Kantian distinction between constructive ideas and regulative ideas, but he applies them precisely to socialist struggle. And he, as I read it, literally is making the claim that, kind of going back to the last question we looked at, in fact, the uber transcendental proposal would be the notion of a constructive idea, vis-a-vis Stalinism, Maoism, and so on. I think that actually might be more what the questioner was driving at, whereas the regulative idea is this sort of coexistence of the capacity for synthetic judgment amongst autonomous individuals. So on the one hand, it's reaffirming a philosophy of the individual, which for Marxists, very critical of the bourgeois definition of the individual. I mean, I think there's a lot of very compelling French theory in particular, which is absolutely put a great deal of skepticism on the notion of whether we should be committed to individualist projects, not only as a critique of identity, but also like sort of seriously historicizing that. And I think that Karatani, because he has a kind of quasi-teleological view of history, is able to place Kant in the same way that Lucien Goldman, the Marxist Kantian, was able to place Kant, which was he is both in and outside of the bourgeois worldview. So Goldman will famously say, even though Kant was operating in a world of what he called reified consciousness, this Lukácsian idea, he's still able to point to a community of emancipation beyond it, right? So he kind of has a partial realization of the inadequacy, but he becomes an exemplar of the sort of the peak of the reified bourgeois culture itself. So he's kind of both in and out. And so anyways, that's a helpful thing. Now, the other striking thing that I found striking in the conversation in the chapter called Nation was Karatani's theory of fascism. And what's striking about his theory of fascism is that it's not that different than social democracy as a specific response to the birth of capital nation state in the 19th century. So he says, you know, it returns to mode A, but in a nostalgic way. So here's a way you could actually understand the difference of constructive versus regulative idea, because regulative is somehow futural, it's somehow open and so on, whereas constructive is either nostalgic, but somehow tethered to a return to A in such a way where it's not able to abolish present existing conditions, let's say. The other thing I wanted to flag here is the notion of an act of enlightenment. You'll notice that on multiple occasions, he is critiquing socialist revolutionaries for advocating a transition out of capitalism vis-a-vis an active enlightenment. And we'll see this when we get to his conversation on superego and death drive, but my reading here is that he's basically putting forward the argument that an active enlightenment is the kind of vulgarization of the project of the Enlightenment, whereby a certain proposal of reason in a sort of rigid format would function as an educative device for, and here obviously Karatani, although he does not say it, would be a major opponent to the project of re-education in China in the Cultural Revolution. And I think that might be a sort of example par excellence of what he means by the downside of active enlightenment. So we can see that liberalism, state socialism, and fascism, this is actually Gabriel's nice visual graph of it, somehow leans on one mode from the trinity that comes out of the French Revolution of liberty, egalitarianism, and fraternity, which maps onto capital nation state. And I like how it maps onto capital nation state in part because I've always, even though Karatani doesn't invoke the notion of demands, the, let's say, values that undergird each of the spheres emerge from the place of associative demands, right? Like they emerge from, if you like, the underbelly of regulative ideas that emerge spontaneously from the French Revolution itself, right? And so they kind of are themselves transcendental ideas that sort of map a horizon of an unfinished project, right? And so this, I think, is very clear. Obviously, liberalism is paramount because C and mode C has sort of a dominance. But I think that since the birth of capital nation state after 1848, mode C has always remained paramount. It's not that we should think about the autonomy of one over the other in the period of capitalism. It's not like that. It's rather that these political ideologies lean on one to mitigate the antagonisms of C. And they do so in different ways, which we'll get into. One very interesting and beautiful point that he raises is that Marx, in fact, had a theory of a kind of mode D, if you like, but his was a theory which was a return to mode A. And so he therefore makes the claim that all of this business of a kind of positive reciprocity return through communist revolution, Marx actually in Grundrisse and the Urtext and other unpublished material that many people have not read, or sort of semi-published, let's say, came forward with this distinction between natural community and material community. I don't know if you're familiar with this. If you are not, you should definitely read this text called Capital and Community by Jacques Camate. It's an incredible book. The endnotes community is very fond of his work. And what I wish to point out to you is that, in fact, I really believe that it would be nice to see Karatani in a kind of polemic with this tradition of Marxism. Why? Because if we take seriously the idea that financial capitalism produces a notion of real subsumption, which means that the autonomy of labor is subsumed by capital, it sort of enters into a relation of immobility, of a kind of envelopment by capital, which is a kind of apocalyptic and sort of a dark prospect. Well, as you see, I've highlighted here, even the ruling class is dominated, you see. So I definitely think, therefore, that there's a certain, he's right, that in the Grundrisse and other areas, Marx has all sorts of things to say about community, all sorts of things, maybe even to say about the return of mode A and the kind of longing for a return to mode A and the kind of inadequacy of capital's solution, because capital offers a solution, which he calls the material community, but there's a kind of latent nostalgia for a return to pre-commodified. So Marx was fully aware of that. Yet, I think that this notion that Karatani gives us that mode B as the state is governed by a separate logic of exchange than C would be denied by a thinker like Kamate because of what he says here. Even the ruling class is governed in the stage of real subsumption in this way. So I think he would deny that point. Okay. This I thought was useful to give us a grander perspective. I don't know how familiar you are with world systems theory. Arihi, Wallerstein, and others are considered. And I actually think Karatani is giving us a very unique reperiodization of Wallerstein's original periodization. And the most novel point is that the stage of neoliberalism, well, on the one hand, it starts much later than normal periodizations have it. I mean, usually when the United States went off the gold reserve, I think in 1973, a lot of people locate this as this sort of beginning point, and then it becomes formalized vis-a-vis state power with the election of Margaret Thatcher in 1980 and Ronald Reagan and so on. But he actually starts it in 1990. So that's one difference. The other difference, and here it's a difference of how he critiques Hart and Negri, is that the state is not governed by the US as sole hegemon under the period of neoliberalism. It was during like welfare state and so on, but we've entered into a imperialistic stage, which he calls regionalism, which basically means that we are in a sort of war of contention over the emergence of a hegemon. If you're familiar with Wallerstein's thesis, this is actually a better thesis, because I really find in Wallerstein's notion of the autumn of financial capitalism, which he declares we are in now, kind of an unclear theory for how a new hegemon emerges. And we're just sort of left to assume that it has to do with inevitability of China and so on. I think the other thing that we should take note of here is, and this actually is going to be elaborated on the next page, is that in order for a new hegemon to enter, a new regime or a new cycle of accumulation must transpire. And Karatani is claiming that such a cycle necessitates the development of, what does he say, unalloyed access to nature. Let me see if I can find, yeah. Will a new hegemon arise? That would require a return to industrial capital accumulation, which presupposes, one, that nature supply unlimited resources from outside the industrial structure. Two, that human nature be available in unlimited supply outside of the capitalist economy. And three, that technological innovation continue without limit. These three conditions have been rapidly disappearing since 1990. So where he is similar to Wallerstein and the kind of orthodox world systems people is in the notion that it's very unclear whether a new return to an industrial accumulation cycle is even feasible. Towards the end of the structure of world history, Karatani says that because of the impossibility of these, of a new hegemon from arising, what is the inevitable outcome? Well, the inevitable outcome is war. And this is where he gives us this whole distinction between, death drive and the United Nations and the development of institutions in the wake of that war, which would be even more robust than the ones that came out of the First and Second World War. So that's a very important point. Let me go back briefly.
Sorry, could you make it full screen? Maybe it'd be better to read.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks.
Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, of course. Let me slightly lower. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So in the modern world system, mode C is dominant. Empire is not possible. Any attempt to build an empire ends up as imperialism. Why is that? Because we do not have a clear hegemonic power. Modern imperialism is not necessarily expansionist in terms of territory. Rather, it aims at expanding trade, or mode C. By way of spreading the market economy into its territory, imperialism tries to gain surplus value. Thus, neoliberalism is imperialist by my definition, as by nature it aims at global expansion of the market. So part of that is that because we lack a hegemon, former expansions of imperialism put a kind of relation of mode B and C is kind of in the background. Now everything is about C, and there's kind of no emergence of a clear hegemon. Even though Holland is not included in the last list, Karatani does sort of agree that modern capitalist system is born in Holland, which is the claim of Wallerstein. I think the other novel thing to note here is how liberalism today, because C is so dominant, and this is a very beautiful point, and I'm going to present you a kind of a way in which this theory relates both to the past period, where liberalism was dominant on the world scene, but also to the present. And he says that in the late 19th century, in the lead up to the First World War, the European powers basically inculcated a sense of social Darwinism, and that mode C became so ossified for the lot of wage laborers that you had this kind of, he doesn't say this, but I think other authors have, a kind of inevitable conflagration over the way in which C had splintered the society to such a degree. I mean, I'm reading this incredible book by Domenico Losurdo on Heidegger, and how basically his argument is that we often place Heidegger in a very skewed light when we neglect the fact that most of what Heidegger was animated by was a kind of perverse jubilation about the liberatory potential of the First World War. And what's very novel about that is that the ruling classes of Europe, situation had got so out of control that the way that they framed the causality of the emergence of the war was completely detethered from a rationalist understanding of class warfare, which was absolutely like the line of causality that needed to be brought to the fore. But it got sort of thrown into this kind of mystical national, realization. So anyways, I think Karatani is correct to say that the kind of regionalism and the liberalism we're seeing today is a certain liberalism that is an unhinged version of C. And I just want to say on that point, can you see this slide here? One of the very sort of controversial, but very, I think, useful ways to understand the emergence of 19th century capitalism and then the emergence of the United States as a hegemonic force is actually through a school of history called the Hartzian School. Marxists hate this guy, although he's kind of hated because he gives a theory as to why Marxism and socialism never emerged in the United States. And his primary theory is that because the United States was founded on the absence of feudal social relations. Like, in other words, instead of Hobbes being the founder of Mode B, it was John Locke. And John Locke's tabula rasa, that kind of clean slate, this classic bourgeois idea, became the kind of sine qua non of any thinking of American Mode B. And yet, Mode C deteriorated the social relations over time, over a few decades since the founding of the country. And upon its deterioration, an ideology was born, what he calls algerism, which is a beautiful ideology, beautiful in its perversity, which is basically that it's the foundation of the Republican Party, in fact. In 1830s, the Republican Party was founded off of an anti-Catholic called the Know Nothing movement, and the Free Soil Party, with the premise that poor workers, and it was then racialized after the fact, but poor workers have a chance to enter the bourgeoisie, have a chance of leisure time, if they kind of Protestantize their orientation to labor. And so it introduces a kind of paternalism that's not dictated by the state, but which is dictated by a kind of throne Mode C relations. And so you have a kind of the birth of entrepreneurialism in its perfect form. And I think it's novel to note that one of the really important thinkers who's come up once, at least in this course, Milanovic, the guy who wrote Capitalism Alone, is kind of like a left of center economist. But in that book, he declares that John Rawls is the philosopher of contemporary capitalism. And in the notion of meritocratic capitalism, you have the means to resolve, although maybe not well, all of the antagonisms that come with a society governed so solely by Mode C. And so what's very novel about Hartz is that he gives us a historical generation point of this through the ideology of algerism. And then he furthermore says, because when you have algerism, you prevent solidarity of working class, socialism, rationalist opportunities from getting off the ground. Because you have a kind of cross-class conflation and a kind of cross-class paternalism, which results in a permanent liberalism, right? So I think Hartz, even though he was a neocon, by the way, he was like a neocon before there were neocons. He really gives the answer, in my view, as to why socialism has never happened in the United States. So I highly recommend this book. He also says that by the time of Roosevelt's New Deal, the mythos, he calls it a myth. Algerism is a myth. And what is algerism? It's a series of books written by a guy named Horatio Alger that tell these stories of young boys born into abject poverty who perform on the market, gain the attention of a wealthy person. That person gives them patronage and then sets them free as entrepreneurs. It's a kind of rags to riches entrepreneurial escape from wage labor. So if algerism could work, it had to be racially exclusive to whites. And now, if you fast forward to the kind of post-1970s period, you can see that the American state has literally concocted a scenario in which the meritocratic promise is central, but they're trying to negotiate the kind of racial antagonisms and racial residues which still plague it, you see. So the problem with this also is that during the Cold War, this Lockean equality, this kind of end of history notion, why is it end of history? Because if the proposal of the society is one in which we have no legacy of oppression to speak of, again, his theory of the American Revolution, and I think this is a correct theory, unfortunately, is that it was a bourgeois revolution. In other words, it's very different than the French Revolution, because in the French Revolution, we're talking hundreds of years of relations between neighbors and people on this side of the river and that side of the river that are feudal in nature, you see. So it creates a certain animus, which was absent in the American context. Added to which, if you look at the demands of the American Revolution, they are largely couched within Mode C. So this is something to consider at the least. Okay. Then Karatani discusses this notion of repetition. He's written a whole book on the reading of the 18th of Brumaire. But what I think is really significant here is that his claim that a nation state is incapable of becoming an empire because the centralized state is born in as a negation of the principle of empire. So he's making this claim, which kind of links to my theory about the American state, which is that there's a kind of collective memory of state's power that at times prevents it from realizing its former glory. And there's a sort of structural impediment to that. So that's a very significant point. We've already talked about this notion of hegemon. We've already talked about algerism. So that's basically chapter 11. Are there any burning comments or questions? You all have been so kind and quiet as I rant.
I've been kind of.
Please, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. I've been kind of curious about what exactly is an example of this cooperative economy, or like the producer co-ops. Like, what does that look like? Does that exist? What are they?
Yeah, that's a good question. We'll get to that in a moment.
Okay.
Yeah. I think we'll get to that. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Maybe they exist, but not exactly as they should, in Karatani's vision, I think might be one way to say it. So these are some sort of axiomatic points that I think we should all, as Karatanians, keep very close to us. Number one, for all of the critiques that I offered to him on this sort of ethical capitalism and the kind of vagueness of regulative idea, he very clearly says, any capitalism that does not aim at the abolition of the state is not revolutionary. And furthermore, all socialism is revolutionary socialism. It's very novel that, the text that he wrote, Neoliberalism as a Historical Stage, which considers Donald Trump and all of that, doesn't really change its position in that text, which was a lecture he gave after Trump. But it's very interesting to me that, yes, Karatani, I think, rightly critiques social democracy. Yet when you look at a situation like the United States of America, which has never had anything close to it, it reminds me of a debate within Marxist scholarship today, which makes the claim, and even the late Bernard Stiegler, who died since we last met, is very big on this following idea, which is that the form of capitalism we're in now, we somehow need to resurrect the older form in order to negate the current form. Like, we're in this kind of hall of mirrors that's just like a void or something. And we need to kind of work to, like, so therefore, like, yes, a kind of Bernie Sanders would be useful so that we can at least get our fucking bearings straight. Karatani would, I think, be opposed to that idea, given his ardent criticism of social democracy. Anyways, revolt at the site of production is inadequate. And I think he makes a nice sort of logical claim as to why it's inadequate, which is that when you start revolting up at the factory, what happens? Well, you start advocating for a higher wage, which, as you should, right? But the problem with that is that it is a dead end for socialist politics. So he is critiquing, I think, two things here. He's critiquing Leninism, and he's critiquing social democracy. In the sense that the sight of workers as a revolutionary cell, Leninism, or the sight of strengthening of labor unions and so on, social democracy, are both inadequate, in part because they are too narrow of a definition of the revolutionary agent. A worker is too limited of a category. Not only because it, and I think Marxists are guilty of this. I mean, like in the United States, if you go onto Twitter, a worker is somebody who works at like concrete construction. Everybody else is kind of like a trader, you know, or is kind of like a, I don't know, like a bourgeois sellout or somewhere in between, you know? So, I mean, I appreciate that because often social democracy has a very nostalgic and very perverse definition of what a worker is, and a very limited definition of what a worker is. And I also would say, even though he doesn't invoke the category of real subsumption like Antonio Negri does and many other Marxists do in the stage of financial capitalism, which we discussed before, I really think that he's acutely aware of this proposal. I'm not sure that he needs it, though, given his apparatus. The other thing is sort of an epistemological point, is that if we are limiting our theory of revolution to the site of production, to workers and so on, we're not able to capture capital as a totality. It's a very interesting point that he doesn't really, this is on around like 289, 290, he doesn't really return to that, but I wonder about that point. If workers decide to resist capital, they should do so not from the site where this is difficult, but rather from the site where they enjoy a dominant position vis-a-vis capital. I think the point of inner passivity, which has come up before as a kind of Gabriel's sort of beautiful proposal to sort of reverse inner passivity towards the cause of emancipation, is very pertinent in Karatani's theory here, in part because, I don't know, one gets a vision of the organization of alternative economies and organization of anti-consumerism and so on as being one that's kind of highly streamlined and could be kind of also inclusive of like a marketing campaign. And I know that marketing and the left have a very difficult history, especially after Occupy Wall Street. I'm thinking here of the sort of strange intergenerational conflagration over ad busters as a messaging arm of Occupy Wall Street, and how you had this kind of Gen X millennial division. And I'm also wondering whether anti-consumer struggles are too free in their conception of interpassive struggle, but I don't know. So our definition of the worker must therefore expand. It's not, as he thinks many Marxists argue, and I think this is actually a real debate right now on the left. Jody Dean just published a very interesting debate around whether this kind of Silicon Valley informational capitalism that we live in is actually a form of feudalism, right? And it's obviously the case that in 1848, during the Communist Manifesto, workers fully conceived of their toil as a neo-feudalism. But what makes workers unique is their capacity for consumption, unlike the slave and the serf. So that's a very interesting point. I think we've had this problem with Karatani before, where he will remind us that the toil of a worker under capitalism, in some sense, requires or asks more of the agent than under other forms of oppression. That's a kind of comment which is very hard to wrap one's mind around. So then obviously, towards the conclusion, he's mapping very concrete tactics against mode C, separate from mode B, because both have an autonomous logic. So you guys can read these points. I think obviously it's refreshing that the definition of proletariat's expanded. It's also refreshing that consumer struggles sort of conceive of resistance in this way, and one can obviously see the linkage to nonviolence there and so on. And another beautiful sort of aspect is he finds a way to address what we on the American left have in a very naive way, called race versus class. I don't know if in Brazil or in Australia you guys have these same polemics, but for whatever reason, since 2008, we've had this kind of chaotic, mind-numbing debate on race versus class, and it's drives me crazy. Some of you guys might know Assad Haider, who's written an incredible book on this topic. So Karatani solves this very easily. But he also, why does he solve it? Well, he solves it because he says, against Marxists, or against, let's say, orthodox Marxists, capitalism produces antagonisms which are moral in nature. So therefore, we should not fear or shy away from confronting the deleterious effects of Mode C on things like gender struggles and so on. And I think many Marxists have a theory for that. But what I like about Karatani's is the kind of easy precision of what he's offering there. I've made this point when I gave a talk on Karatani before, but I wonder what Karatani's theory of the riot might be. In the work of the EndNotes community, they have a beautiful theory of what they call surplus riots as a unique tactic, almost a spontaneous tactic of anti-capitalist agitation in the post-1970s to the present period. It's like more so than strikes, right? Like actually proletarian activity is actually felt most at a level of frequency in riot activity versus strike, which is contestations at the level of factory, job place, and so on. And so when we talk about circulation, it's very interesting because that is a circulation struggle. A riot is a circulation struggle, right? So I wonder how he might theorize that. Anyways, counter movements against Mode B. Obviously, his notion of the nation is one, and he has a beautiful sort of recapitulation of Benedict Anderson's, I mean, Imagine Communities by Benedict Anderson is a very interesting text. And I like Karatani's reminding us of why it was written, which was there was a certain obvious, from the gaze of an onlooker, an obvious simpatico relationship amongst Asian nations around the joining of into communism in the 20th century. Yet there was a unknown antagonism which was blocking this. And it was the kind of ideology of the nation which was supervening. And so Karatani has a certain sense in which, and I'd like to actually tease this out more, but how precisely does the nation and affiliations and fraternal, because remember fraternity is the affect of the nation. I think it's very clear how Mode B withers through associationist struggle, but it's less clear to me how the nation withers. So that's something that I'd like to throw out there and see what you all think about that. Obviously, we're going to get into this in a moment, but he is very critical of the sort of liberal Kantian reading of what Kant meant by his short text on perpetual peace. He put all of that into question. So here it is. So hopefully you all can see this. I love this breaking it down that he performs here. I mean, on the one hand, he's basically saying that we have three sort of preeminent, albeit flawed, theories for how to deal with the fundamental antagonism or problematic of capital nation state. And they are provided by these proper names of Kant, Hegel, and Marx. And so I, just as an aside, I gave a talk on Karatani to this sort of GW, George Washington University community. They're all like liberal Kantians. And they were honestly like convinced. And it was kind of one of those like disavowal moments of being convinced. Like maybe they were just telling me they were convinced, but they sincerely seemed like they were convinced of Karatani over Rawls, because they were all Rawlsians. And obviously, you know, the distinction between Rawls, and remember, Rawls is, I think, rightly invoked as the philosopher of neoliberalism, which is ironic because he was actually writing during the peak of the welfare state, which is precisely what the left today wishes they could go back to. So he's writing in the peak of what we perceive as a kind of harmonious period of global capitalism. And he's writing a kind of model of social relations and society that we live in now, which is a horrific model, right? Like meritocratic liberal capitalism is shitty, right? There's no way around it. So, but thankfully there are actually a lot of sort of Rawlsians that are kind of becoming socialists and sort of really not canceling him, but really putting him under scrutiny. So you can see this is the model of Kant, and the real kind of intellectuals that would support this first model would kind of be the folks who were sort of the Clintonite third way humanitarian intervention, soft power, kind of in IR theory sort of people, kind of standard liberals, or what we might call neoliberals. Then in a very sacrilege way, Hegel is invoked in a kind of evil genius version of Hegel as noting that the antinomy of capital nation state can only be realized by a sovereign power, i.e. America, and America must affirm its, I think this is a dead dream by now, it's totally over, but we're familiar with it, and it's kind of a mockery. But the fact that Hegel is associated with it is maybe something we could debate. And then he says the standard version of Marx is actually exemplified by Hart and Negri, and it is this, I don't know, this kind of accelerationist vision and so on. So he says in each model, they become reliant on mode B and do not address mode C through exchange. Number two, by leaving C unaddressed, they do not stop the cycle of imperialism. And obviously imperialism does not necessitate a hot war. We can have a kind of Cold War imperialism like we currently do. And obviously, you know, the solution. And I know in the questions, we had some questions on this notion of voluntary disarmament of weapons and the challenges there. I think these are real challenges. Now, let me preface the next slide by saying a couple of things. You'll remember that Karatani makes the point that the birth of the League of Nations was literally a kind of manifestation of Kant's vision of perpetual peace. But as a logic of history, it could only be realized through the antagonism of the dismantling or the fragmentation of the nation warfare itself. And so Karatani gives us a kind of dialectic that is Kantian, but also Freudian. And so I've, hopefully you all can see this. You'll know this essay by Kant. It's kind of like Marx's thesis on Feuerbach. It's this kind of, in terms of its structure. But he says this in the fourth thesis, And Karatani quotes this all the time. The notion is that the kind of logic of sociality, of man's relation to man, community, etc., is governed by what he calls an unsocial sociability. And that means that this goes back to, remember, an act of enlightenment. Remember that phrase? This means that Kant's vision of history is not some vulgar enlightenment notion. It means that it's not reason that's guiding history, it's unsocial sociability that's guiding history. And unsocial sociability is what Freud discovers after the First World War, precisely in his notion in Beyond the Pleasure principle of death drive. So Karatani gives us a way in which the logic of history can be mapped onto a kind of Kantian Freudian structure. And I would also say that I think that even though it's vague to me, I know the question of nature has come up quite a lot, but I think we might want to place nature, as I've tried to in the graph, along this axis. So I'll stop there and see if anybody has any comments on this. And obviously the notion of death drive is important because he says that, you know, before the First World War, Freud had this theory of the superego as a censor, as this fully kind of external or like parental force. But after he realized that the antagonisms of the unconscious are internalized vis-a-vis death drive, it's a fully autonomous source. So it's, he had to theorize it, but yet the superegoic still remains. So I claim that they are kind of, must be thought in a dialectical fashion. And if anyone is interested, actually Karatani's written a book about this, on the nation, on the concept of the nation, and Freud and Kant, on Freud and Kant, where he elaborates on all of this in much more detail. So, is all of this clear, or is anybody sort of in the dark on these concepts? I hope I haven't gone too fast.
I just think it brings up a lot of questions we cannot even think how to start with. Like,
I know. It's very nice. I mean, I think I wonder what you think. Maybe I can just pose a question to you. Well, do you think about his notion of reason? I mean, in some sense, I think that Kantians or Kantianism and so on are often lambasted as a vulgar enlightenment, or proposing kind of social change vis-a-vis a vulgar enlightenment, vulgar use of reason. Whereas in this model, Karatani is sort of thinking the human and the evolution of sort of human subjectivity, right? I mean, he makes this really interesting distinction in the Freud and Kant book. But anyways, I want to stop and let people this is my very sophomoric attempt to graph. I had to send it to Gabriel to find out if he approved. He said he liked it.
I feel like I've been waiting the entire time for this. For this.
Yeah.
I was waiting for this material, you know what I mean?
There's quite a lot to unpack. I mean, one of the things I also wanted to sort of throw on the table was, you know, Karatani is not the only philosopher, political philosopher, etc., who gives us a theory of mode D, what he calls mode D. mean, obviously, we have mentioned before, there's a long tradition in Marxist scholarship under the name of communism, communist invariance, which was opened by Engels' book on the peasant rebellion, peasant war in Germany, which is this notion that there is a kind of emancipatory logic of human emancipation, which is pre-capitalist, in which you can kind of locate as a way to periodize novelty of history, right? So you have that. But I was also thinking about it, and I realized that you have two strains of contemporary thought, two lineages that theorize mode D in ways which are very different than Karatani. And so that's actually my next presentation to you, but we can talk about this, or maybe I can present that and come back.
Yeah, I had a question. How does Karatani sort of mitigate between nature and death drive? Because I guess a lot of psychoanalytic theory proposes death drive as a kind of break from nature.
Right. I don't know. I mean, it's something to think about. I'm not sure that as a Kantian, he's not really interested in working in an ontological register, right? And so I think when you have considerations at this level of abstraction, I think that there's a lot of questions which are uninteresting to Karatani, maybe. Sort of minute, what he might perceive as kind of the minutia of philosophical speculation, which may not be as pertinent. So therefore, one is only left to assume, perhaps. But for those that have a stronger intuition on this, or even a stronger sense of what he does say, I would recommend that people jump in. Yeah, I mean, what do you mean, Laurent, by death drive is outside of nature?
Well, I think maybe I could. There is this interesting parallel he was making between like Hegel's cunning of reason,
Yes,
versus this cunning of nature, which would be, I guess, incarnated by the death drive. Is that what you meant, Lauren? Is that where you?
that's a very good distinction, Antonio. Thank you for raising that. Yes, yes, and he's kind of cunning of reason is perceived in the same negative sense as active enlightenment is conceived, right?
But this parallel is still kind of difficult to me. He didn't really spend a lot of time explaining it or describing it. I just guess
I know.
I guess that's like cunning of nature is always retroactive. I guess cunning of reason. Sorry, like there is this kind of say imperial force that becomes hegemonic and then dictates retroactively what the state of the world is, or something like this. Whereas the cunning of nature seems to be almost ahistorical, even or at least belongs to this repressed past or something like this.
Yeah. I mean, it really reminds me of his reading of Socrates as an ardent materialist, and how, you know, reason as untethered from material relations of exchange is sort of uninteresting. This is something which is like a naive, I don't know, you see, like, I think there is a certain materialism inherent in his insistence on this notion of the motor of history is this kind of death drive reservoir, so to speak. So that's my first inclination, but again, I don't think he develops that, nor does he care to develop it, maybe. Which the fact that he doesn't care about it kind of evokes Gabriel's theme throughout this course of the scaling, right? And the kind of, the question of what's an important philosophical problem and what's not. Because I think that there are a lot of philosophical traditions that are going to interrogate that and try to derive a lot more significance from that interrogation into this relationship between subjectivity's relationship to nature and ontology and so on. But yeah, let me briefly, we can come back to this crazy thing. So before we do, I think it's important to note from Gabriel's last slides, or maybe this was 2 sections ago, that, you know, within each mode, mode D has a kind of a spectral presence, or it has some kind of instantiation, let's say, right? And I think by now we are familiar with all of this, right? Now, the thing I wanted to introduce is I realized that if you think about gift exchange, not in this kind of Marcel Mauss kind of anthropological sense, but if you think about exchange in more of a philosophical register, I think you actually have a couple lineages that are very interested in exchange. Now, we already know that the Nietzschean line is actually very important for Karatani, in the sense that morality is derived for Nietzsche out of the creditor-debtor relation. This is fundamental, one of the fundamental theses of genealogy of all morals. However, if you are sort of in the lineage of Nietzsche or Nietzscheanism, you sort of get a much more pessimistic thesis around exchange and the possibility of a kind of version of mode D that Karatani would favor, right? And I think that even Lyotard's, good night, honey, love you. Even Lyotard's libidinal economy, I don't know if you guys have read that text. He calls it like his dark, evil book. He explicitly says any notion of a community trying to resurrect superego or something like this must be completely abandoned. It always will result in a kind of militarization and so on. So he really opts for a kind of strange opting out. I mean, even he gives us a critique of what he calls young girl Marx in this book. It's actually quite funny. He has old man Marx and young girl Marx. And young girl Marx is the kind of figure who is the quasi-theologian who's thinking mode D as a kind of proletarian revolution in which we can think a society of non-antagonism, right? Very reminiscent of associationism. And he casts all sorts of aspersions of doubt on this. Similarly, if you read the book Living Currency, which Michel Foucault said was the most important book that he's ever read, here you get the same pessimism, right? Which is that any exchange actually keeps a kind of residue on the body, that because they invoke the body. Karatani's not interested in invocation of the body, as far as I can tell. And you also see this with Lacan, I would say. You see this in the ethics seminar. And you see this with why is it the Marquis de Sade is elevated in the way that he's elevated, right? As a kind of figure of an impossible sexual exchange and so on. Maybe that's a bad reading, but nonetheless, and Deleuze could be affiliated with this line as well. I went back and I looked at Anti-Oedipus, and they really resist the way to think about capital as one of exchange. They really think about capital as a form of inscription and of theft and so on. And so they're really not great thinkers of exchange. I could be missing some things, but I was having a hard time putting them into dialogue with this. But I do think that obviously, and here, you know, Nietzsche's notion of resentment, his notion of resentment is not something which a mode D would necessarily usurp or sublate, by the way, right? So that's a lineage worth thinking through. I think another lineage would be Heideggerianism. I kind of invoke that negative story of Heidegger as a thinker of war, and I think Losuro is correct about that. But Jean-Luc Nancy, in his notion of inoperative community, is also a very pertinent thinker for a thinker like Karatani, in part because what Nancy is thinking about Maudit, what we can call Maudit, but what he calls the inoperative community, is a kind of rivalry with Mode C. He's thinking a same type of alternative exchange, but at this kind of abstract exchange of those who have nothing in common, right? So he's trying to think this kind of post-identitarian form of communal belonging founded in a unique form of alienation, right? And so you sort of have not that many examples that he gives, but one can think of a number of kind of complicated, let's call it a complicated tapestry of proletarian organization, which Karatani also discusses as being of paramount necessity. Even the multitude could be included in what I'm saying, as this real aporia, this real question of how precisely do we organize and pierce through structures of resentment, structures of intense identitarian commitments, and so on, right? So I think Nancy is a figure who can think the dissonance of communal relations in a very beautiful way. So he has a theory called Anarchic Democracy. And it's very similar to this kind of Proudhon anarchist association thing. So I would love to see a paper that sort of says actually Nancy and Karatani, Nancy can help here with sort of filling out Maudit in some ways. And so the Heideggerian line, especially what Nancy does to it, is he defascizes it by emphasizing the centrality of the Mitsein, of the being with, and he does not want to think a Heideggerianism, which would be a kind of reification of a totalized sense of community, right? So he keeps this kind of negative, dissonant, being together apart thing, which Rancière also is kind of also a part of. And he also invokes the category of ontology. And so there's actually some great polemics with he and Bédieu, with Nancy and Bédieu, on communism and community and so on, which I would recommend. One could also perhaps add the Lacanian left as a genealogy worth tracking a certain theory of Maudit, despite Lacanianism's aversions to utopianism, right? Perhaps one could do that. You know, you could think about the kind of empty signifier. You could think about Laclau, although forget the social democracy, populism, Laclau, but you could think through a logic of the signifier. I think somebody raised that in one of the questions. So what I'm trying to think is sort of what are some allies or comrades in the nebulous invocation of Maudit. So these are just two sort of lineages, but perhaps there are others. I'll go back to this tortuous graph.
It made me think in terms of other ways of thinking about Maudit.
Yes.
Thinking from a point of view of literature, but translation. There's a book called The World Republic of Letters by Pascali Casanova, where she's talking about world literature and reminded me a lot of the Karatani point and the Kant point. And I wonder what you think about translation as a mode of exchange. We're all reading this in translation, and a lot of the people here are speaking English as a second language. And so made me think about relationships between imperial English as an imperial language
Interesting. Yeah.
Just thought it would be an interesting kind of different way of thinking about exchange.
Yeah. I think that the notion of associationism, if you read the manifesto of Karatani, is very much regional, because capital is regional, right? So we are experiencing an epoch of global capitalism, which is kind of a highly fragmented regionalism, which is also an account which we haven't discussed, and which Karatani kind of gives us a hint for why that regionalism stokes fundamentalist religious resurgence. So I like the fact that membership in the association must be regional, and you must retain your local commitments. So yet you are connected to a global body, right? So there is a certain sense in which it would be a cunning of reason move to assume that we could sort of sovereignly use the method of translation or a singular lingua franca in that bombastic way. I would see that as something to avoid. Although, did you notice that the structure of his manifesto, it still has the Produn lottery for like 90% of the elected officials. It's totally by chance. Yet there are like a few on the top that are elected. So you still kind of retain mode D in minimal form, right? But the vast majority of like everyday governing is, so I kind of like that. Like the sovereign sort of has a kind of minimal place that's retained. That's how I read it, right? But it's not sovereign all the way down, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, it would be like English becoming an international language, but even people who speak English as a first language needing to have, like, English is an international language being so different from local Englishes that they almost constitute two different languages, which is happening with, I think, British English as it's spoken in London isn't mutually intelligible with international business English.
Interesting. Yeah, that's interesting. Huh.
Apparently, even in academics, it seems like there is another English, which is the non-English English, like.
Exactly.
What is that?
What I speak, for example.
I don't understand that distinction.
No, I mean, you think of English as becoming a lingua franca, in the sense that it operates some kind of submission of other cultures to its own logics, how can I put it, grammatics. Yeah. But actually what you have is also the way that English has rapidly transformed itself for, I don't know, 500 years or so, in order for it to become a lingua franca too. So it's kind of, there's a process of this non-Englishing of English. I don't know how to put it. It's a de-essentialization of English in a certain sense, in order for it to become lingua franca. I reckon this is also what happens with Greek in ancient world. Yeah. Which became lingua franca by transforming it.
Wasn't it Latin that was the sort of lingua franca? Because you had this Vulgate Latin. Vulgate Latin was...
The expression lingua franca itself is Latin, right? But this is kind of what happened in medieval Europe.
What's really interesting, though, is once you had... I was reading Mark Bloch's incredible book on feudal society in Europe. I highly recommend it because Sylvain Lazarus, in his Anthropology of the Name, which several of us recently read, just lauds this text. He loves it, right? But one of the striking things there was literally within like 3 years, the decentering of Latin and the autonomization of local dialects propelled literacy in European society, and like literally within like, I don't know, less than 10 years, the European society had like all of these new forms of culture and expression and theater and so on. really interesting kind of undergirding force to what would become Renaissance. So I think, yeah, I mean, I'm no specialist on translation really, but it's a very interesting idea.
Yeah, because it's similar to what Chrysanth was saying, that British English is now a minority English within English as a global language.
Right.
And similar with Greek, the Gospels were written in Imperial Greek, which is a kind of basic version of Greek, easier to learn in the Greek colonies. And so
The Greek
I think it's
are amazing. They're
Yeah, and you have to notice that one of Christ's disciples had a Greek name, right? So
Yeah.
it was Roman Empire, but in Judea, people had Greek names, not Latin names.
If you ask a Greek Orthodox theologian, he'll say, ask a Catholic to describe the Trinity in a way that makes sense. And you'll get 100,000 different answers. But he says, if you ask a Greek Orthodox, we always are clear. But it is sort of true. Greek Orthodox Christianity is a very fascinating and honestly like coherent Christianity, I would say, in my limited understanding of it. And maybe it has something to do with this continuity of the language. I don't know.
There are a number of issues, I think, here that are difficult, because really being, how can I put it, like this mode D speculation of Karatani, to my impression, please don't misunderstand what I'm saying, but to my impression is like the weakest Karatani. I much rather prefer how he develops the differences between the modes of exchange and how it is that, you know, sedentarism suddenly became a tendency and so on. Because again, it's always very vague. You have all these lineages of thinking it, and it's very interesting. But to my understanding, what we see today is a kind of this, you know, you started your speech with your, I don't know, your talk, I don't know, with the theme of Thucydides' trap, you know, like China is growing up, will the United States and China, will it become a war, and so on. I wonder if we could, because, you know, mode D is so far from this world we live in. I wonder if we couldn't think of those, you know, Borromean knots and the three ideologies sort of resembles the way it was in Second World War, but maybe it is very up to date. Like we can think these, you know, those three Bohemian knots, whether when a nation, state, and capital becomes three ideologies. So it's like a combination of 3, 2 to 2, and it's equal to 3 other positions in this struggle for these cycles. I don't know how to. And I wonder whether we could think of these developments of, you know, United States versus China, how Europe stands in this position. I wonder whether we could interpret it with Karatani tools, like.
I certainly think that has a point on neoliberalism as imperialistic, even though I don't hear anybody making that claim. And he states it very clearly that Marxists do not see the contemporary epoch as one of imperialism. So, but it makes sense, right? It makes sense that there's a sort of internal barrier to the emergence of any one hegemon, in part because mode C is so dominant. So you cannot, number one, but number two, there's a very interesting point about climate change and the impossibility of the restoration of a return to industrial capitalism. So I think that this kind of, and I always get this sense from the world systems theory people, that the horizon of what's next is a complete unknown. both in terms of what's going to be the hegemon, or even whether a new cycle of capitalism is even possible, which is then why all of the literature now is about post-capitalist futures. So there is a sense in which mode D is necessary along that line of invocation, which is absolutely a negative form of mode D, because it necessitates violence, because it necessitates war. And he's clear on that. So, you know, I'm very skeptical about his praxis. I think that there are some naive aspects to the associationist proposal as he sees it. Yet I think that there are also some very strong points. I've tried to isolate them. One, the way he deals with identity is very good. I am more and more convinced that worker struggles obviously need some expansive, I mean, even for the left, to call somebody that's a part of a revolutionary movement not a worker feels foreign. Like, yet at the same time, that kind of Gen X attempt to sort of do a sort of entrepreneurial revolution like Occupy Wall Street, which is very Karatani-esque. I really think his philosophy is in line with a lot of the anti-globalization stuff. It failed. So we should be sober about its failure, you know? That's how I see it, though. What do you guys think?
I keep on thinking how it is, he always talks, he spends this associationist part of the book talking about cooperatives and shareholders associations and so on. And I wonder if it isn't a kind of a lack of historical analysis, one which, for example, Lo Surdo would plainly reject, which is denying the experiences of what he calls state socialism. Because when these three Borromean knots are organized like that, it seems that they are all equal in not being a part of mode D. And sometimes I think that post-capitalism, which is in the near future horizon, will be probably fascist, and mainly because of this kind of denial, you know?
Yeah. I completely agree with that. Yeah. It is a terrifying prospect, isn't it? My God. Yeah, no, but it seems like in many ways that the liberalism of late 19th century, the use of meritocratic things, the social Darwinistic aspects, the fact that class can no longer rationally be cited as that which we must transcend, the fact that the left more and more beyond the Western countries cannot speak the language of class struggle, presents a real problem, which kind of ties to Gabriel's point about Lenin being unable to know what the fuck to do with the peasantry, because the composition of their consciousness does not lend itself to the same causality as the proletariat does. So yeah, I think that's interesting, and a dire sort of situation in many ways. But I know that other people have probably wanted to, I also wanted other folks to say things about the conclusion of the text, exert your opinions, your polemics, your frustrations with the text. Maybe we can do some of that on Saturday. But yeah, like, what do you guys think? I mean, I agree with you, Cristiano, that his strength may not be in this kind of praxis, especially given what do his followers of associationism say about it today? They kind of have abandoned it, right? Yeah. So yeah, it's maybe not his strength, but that doesn't mean what he says about mode D, or that mode D is somehow very distant from us. That just depends on how we theorize it, no? I don't know. But what do you all think? Lauren, you're in a robe. Is it very early where you are?
Yeah, it's quite early. I don't normally wear this. I wear this at early times. Yeah.
Very comfortable.
Yeah.
Don, are you
It's
drinking
important.
beer? Are you drinking a beer?
I've had a few beers tonight, thinking about spheres of circulation
For you.
entering my body and circulating throughout my
You're allowed to drink on Monday nights in quarantine, right?
Yeah, I think that's the rule. I think that's definitely the rule. You're allowed to engage in hedonism of any sort during quarantine. Yeah, but I think something to me that I've been wanting to bring up, you mentioned earlier the Zizekian sort of like counter to like responsible liberal capitalism of consumerist sort of like, and I don't know how the boycott doesn't fall into that trap of the logic of capital. I don't see how, like, I don't know, it seems to reify and like allow for the motion of capital to sort of move into the boycott itself. Like the antithesis or the negation will then become the most like the most primary form of the negate. Like the negation will allow for capital to move in. I wonder what.
Yeah, well, I think the
Talk
thing
about
is
that.
he's very insistent that you can't have a boycott unless you have an alternative currency, an alternative economy concurrent to it. So we are limited in our thinking of boycott to liberalism. A. B. What does he mean by alternative currency? He doesn't mean Bitcoin and so on. He actually has a pretty specific, I have not studied the thinker, Gabriel mentioned him once, but it's a fairly elaborate structure with a very specific way of how to handle and manage the surplus generation. And so, but it necessitates massive organization for such a thing, to autonomous and local organization, right? So yeah, I don't know, like I'd like to see some examples of that, you know. And I also think that, yeah, it's a chicken or the egg kind of issue in terms of what gets off the ground first and so on. Obviously, it seems to me that the institutional structure of the alternative economic relations based on reciprocity would have to take precedence before boycotts could have any efficacy, right? It seems to me, but that's not exactly clear in his manifesto. You know, Katie, what are you thinking about?
Thinking about how I have like the worst. Can you turn off? I have like the worst sunburn on my back right now. And I was reading the last 2 chapters at the beach today. It's kind of interesting. Crowded beach.
Yikes.
Yeah, I was just trying to understand what this cooperative. Sorry to bring up the same sort of lame point again. Just
No,
like,
no, it makes
brain
sense.
doesn't work. It's just like, I just found it kind of interesting, actually. And it's sad that it took this long, but it's kind of like the end of the book. I'm finally able to like understand like kind of what's going on, like where it hasn't completely lost me. You know, because also I haven't really been able to keep up with all the reading, so I decided to just actually read the chapters that we're supposed to deal with this week. So that's kind of what I was doing. So that's why everything's like fresh in my brain. But yeah, I don't know.
I mean, yeah, the cooperative stuff is interesting. I would actually prefer to think about Karatani as slightly removed from his own project in terms of his interest in the contemporary, and actually use his theory more to kind of think like, how do we incorporate the riot, for example, which is the main tactic the left has available to it right now, at least in the West, or in the United States in particular, as a example of a sort of circulation struggle and as a kind of nascent sort of, I don't know, like a nascent form of mode D. Why not? So I would venture to make that claim, to think him along that line. But yeah, I would also, I mean, I think the biggest thing for me was the distinction that he offers in the concluding chapters between death drive and superego. And I think he's onto something there, as a mode of thinking political subjectivity that is correct. Forget all of the praxis and the practical whatever. You can do whatever you want. You have your own theory. But from this kind of axiomatic standpoint, I think he has a very nice reading of psychoanalysis at play through Kant, you know? It's very sound. I think that's the most useful. But I'm excited to see what, I've asked the speakers for the title of their talks, but they have not shared them yet, unfortunately. But I'm very excited to see what folks are gonna, how they're gonna take Karatani. Again, I have pushed back on Mackenzie Work's claim that Karatani is a genteel Marxist, which means that what that means is that his mode of transmission is not sensible to like proletarian subjectivity or something like this. For whom Zizek and Badiou and others, they're also genteel Marxists. This is from Capital is Dead. And then the correct, or the proper version of Marxism is vulgar. To be vulgar Marxist is sort of be amongst the people, and your sort of theory is able to. So I kind of push back on that, you know. I mean, certainly the associationist proposal is extremely sensible and comprehensible. There's no jargon, there's no, you know, fancy stuff going on there, it seems to me. So we'll see.
Wark also, I read her critique today of the structure of world history, and she emphasizes a lot of the time his inability to think of man and nature, or human and nature, as a concept and as a construct, and he's always thinking about human versus human relations.
Yeah,
so
we talked about that today. That's a very useful, I think that's a great critique.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I just wonder what that would even, I wonder what that would even look like, a mode D that thinks about human relation.
I think Karatani would disarm that critique though, because the thinking of the categorical imperative, you can go as far as you want in terms of your inclusion of entities into that kind of reciprocity, that kind of radical reciprocity. So you sort of solve that issue there by how you, right? By who's eligible for it. Humans in the Kantian view are privileged, yes, but that doesn't mean that others have to be excluded or something like that. So I don't know, that may have an easy critique in response, but I definitely agree that there's no elaboration on nature and so on, which would be nice to have. Yeah. So, oh yes, sorry, Ariana, the book by Karatani is Freud, just search aesthetics, nation, Freud and Kant, something like that. It's a very, very good text. It's an analysis of how Kant's critique of judgment and the sublime and so on links to all of those debates from Enlightenment thought on the composition of the aesthetic sphere and how that plays into the nation. So he touches on this in Structure of World History, but goes into much more detail in this book. And then the elaboration on Freud and Kant is really, really nice. He makes this incredible distinction. He says, if you really want to understand death drive, you can think about death drive versus superego mapped onto irony and humor. And he says, in humor, you are actually participating in an experience which is without consciousness. Like, it's the absurd. It's like something makes you laugh, which there is no reason, so to speak, right? Whereas in irony, it's all about reason and so on. And he's trying to, it's kind of a nice way to map the fundamental contrast there. And he's basically trying to privilege a form of subjectivity without reason, without consciousness. And I think that's quite nice. And a nice way of thinking psychoanalytic contribution and so on. So, well, I'm tempted to conclude our evening unless anyone has any final questions about Saturday. Help us promote it, please. Look, it's exactly 9 p.m. Help us promote it, though, you know, as best you can. And I think we have some good attendance so far. And yeah, it should be a good time. Hopefully, can everybody come? Is there any challenges? You should be okay. How is it in Australia at the time?
It's 3 a.m. so I might miss it.
Sorry. Okay.
It's all right. I'll watch the restream.
Very good. Well, Antonio says, Karatani's short text about the Japanese army in America, Utopia, is also a nice attempt at a synthesis of death traffic concept. Oh, nice. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, you know, Karatani is very important to me personally because my grandfather fought at Guadalcanal, which was a vicious battle between the Japanese and the Americans. And he was lucky to survive it. Honestly, if you survived Guadalcanal and you're an American and you went back to a social event, people would give you a round of applause because it was like hell on earth. And he hated Japanese people his whole life. I mean, I always think like, you know, liberals have a really fucking perverted idea of racism, and I believe they do because they think racism is this like passionate thing, and it's not true. Like most people that are racist aren't really racist like that. But back then, like my grandfather, his racism towards the Japanese was libidinal. Jouissance. It was, you know, it was this kind of, he once went, I'll never forget, we went to a submarine, you know, they can tour a submarine. We lived in a port town. And he didn't know at the time, but he was entering a Japanese submarine, which was on exhibit long after the war. And he had a total nervous breakdown. Almost fainted. So it's very, very useful. And obviously, yeah, you had the anniversary of the atomic bomb, I think just a couple of days ago. But yeah, it's incredible history, right? It's very interesting as a side note, as communists, or at least most of us are committed to some form of communism. Are you aware that it was the American Communist Party that advocated militantly for the internment of the Japanese in America because of their theory of fascism? They had this kind of vulgar, almost Stalinist theory of fascism, which was that it's like this mental disease that it must be cordoned off. You see, it's kind of a strange. I mean, if we're, you know, we should be honest about these things. I was very surprised to learn that history. And then the liberals, liberal Americans, like.
Where did you hear that? Where did you hear that? Sorry.
Oh, you don't believe me, Katie. I'm just kidding. I read about it.
I'm curious. Like,
I read about it in Mike Davis's book, Prisoners of the American Dream. Incredible book about American labor history and his section on the Communist Party. Yeah. It wasn't the only factor, but it was like the one time that liberals sided with the communists. Like, okay, fine, we'll take your word up for it. But this is partially because they were very beholden to Russia, and the Bolsheviks were at the very front of fighting fascism. You know, then they looked at it with a very different view than liberals did. You know,
I think it's kind of a short circuit that happens between communist ideology of anti-fascism and also America's broad propaganda, social propaganda against the Japanese that were strikingly racist. So that, you know, if you think that Communist Party of America is part of American society, then it's, of course, there are some short circuit really in this ideological stuff.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Hopefully that was helpful. And this concludes our consideration of the book, which has been an incredible experience. And we should do it again with another book. If anybody has any ideas, let us know. Maybe there's another thinker we could interrogate. I know school starts for some people soon, but maybe that won't stop us. I don't know. So, and we will see you on Saturday. Thank you all very much. Have a great night. Take care.